welcome to the first event in the series, The Business of Literary Translation. My name is Sal, and with my co-organizers Bill Martin and Monica Zaleska, who's here with us tonight, I run the Bridge series, which is the only reading series in New York devoted to literary translation. We are also proud to work with the Penn Translation Committee, who co-present this particular series and the series in general with us. And I'm going to invite Alex Zucker up to talk a little bit about that.
Hi everyone, I'm Alex Zucker, co-chair along with Allison Markin Powell of the Penn America Translation Committee. It's great to have you all out here. Thanks to the Center for Fiction for hosting us. The Penn America Translation Committee advocates on behalf of literary translators, working to foster a wider understanding of their art and offering professional resources for translators, publishers, critics, bloggers, and others with an interest in international literature. Just a couple things to know about us, or things coming up. Literary awards, including the translation awards, are going to be announced on March 1st. You should know about our website, penn.org/translation, where you will find the only model contract for literary translation in this country, along with a list of FAQs having to do with contracts and other aspects of the business of literary translation. And if you think you might want to join Penn and the Translation Committee, you can go to penn.org/FAQ. But basically, you can get a professional membership if you've published one book or more. And I just want to let you know that we recently formed a new subcommittee on freedom of expression, so we have a new realm of activity to get involved in. And with that, I'm just going to pass it back to Sal Robinson. Thanks for being here tonight.
And now I'm going to briefly set up this event and the spring series as a whole. I think that it's fair to say, although maybe we can discuss this over the coming months, that the past 10 years has seen a tremendous amount of change in the field of literary translation, from the establishment of new presses and magazines focused on translation, to a push for greater visibility and better conditions for translators, to the growth of academic programs, residencies, and other opportunities for translators to enter their field and do their work. With this series, The Business of Literary Translation, which the Center for Fiction has so kindly agreed to host, we want to take the measure of where things are right now in 2016. This is documentary in aim. I really want you, the audience, and the participants to hear and think about the whole system in full, with all of its pluses and minuses, as it is sort of this year and at this time. But it's also about defining and shaping certain directions for the future. And tonight we'll hear from 5 translators who are already very, very much engaged in doing that. And now I'd like to turn things over to Allison Markin Powell, distinguished translator from Japanese, and our moderator for this evening. Thanks.
I think first we'll just go down the line, and we're going to briefly introduce ourselves and how we came to get involved with literary translation. So, actually, if you wouldn't mind starting, Marianne.
My name is Marianne Newman, and I translate from Catalan and Spanish, mostly Catalan now. I got into literary translation. I think I have a translation gene. I'm one of those people with a vocation, and the first time I understood a poem in Spanish, which was the 20th poem from Neruda's 20 Poems of Love, and a desperate song, I ran to translate it, and then I took it into my mother, and she left. But it was a drive. And a number of years later, in '82, I fell in love with the work of a Catalan author, Quim Monzó, and I translated 3 of his stories and immediately found an agent. And because in those days we did it through agents, and it seemed very easy at the time because the agent found a publisher, and the book was published, and it got a box in the New York Times. And that was how I started, and it took me another 20 years to get another book published.
My name is Heather Cleary. I translate from the Spanish, and I arrived at literary translation as kind of the result of a detour I was working on an undergraduate honors thesis, and it just wasn't coming together. And a professor in the Department of Comparative Literature at NYU, Richard Seaberth, who is an incredible translator, approached me and said, maybe you want to try something different. And I did, and I assigned myself a ridiculously difficult first translation, a play written in verse by Lorca, which I'm sure is hopeless. Thank goodness the archive has been completely lost on that one. But I was hooked, and so ever from that moment on, I've kind of organized my life around this practice that we're all here today to talk about.
I'm Katrine, and I translate from the Danish. And I guess I got into translation, technical translation for money early on. After having worked as a journalist, I started translating subtitles and texts for websites for money to support myself as a freelance journalist. And then I got into Columbia's MFA program in fiction and literary translation. And so I was a fiction writer at first, but then Susan Bernovsky, who's the director of the program, she likes to poke at people and ask them if they would like to take an introductory class to literary translation. And I actually thought it would be similar, but it turned out it wasn't at all. Literary translation is so much more fun. So I just started translating some of my favorite poets from Danish to English, and I found out it was the world's greatest writing exercise. So that got me hooked. But I got my first publication when I worked as an editor at the translation journal Asymptote. So that was sort of how I got into it. Yeah.
Cool. I'm Allison Charette, the other Allison this evening. Is this close enough? Are we good? Okay. I translate from French. I've been focusing a lot on literature from Madagascar because as of right now, there are no novels from Madagascar that have been translated into English. That's going to change next year when the first one's being brought out by Restless Books, which is awesome. I got into translation, much like everyone else. I discovered a passion and got hooked because this is one of those careers that you need a passion for, because you're not going to, we can talk about this, but you're not going to really be able to support yourself just on literary translation. But I had been studying French since junior high. I majored in French at NYU when I was an undergrad. I took a couple of translation courses, and I spent my psychology lectures working on the translation puzzles that I was coming across. And then it still took me another 3 or 4 years to realize, oh, this is something you could do as a career. Right. All right. Okay. So I wandered my way through some translation agencies doing the commercial work before figuring out, oh, wait, what I really like is literature, because that's the interesting stuff. And have basically been doing that ever since.
And so I'm the other Allison. I guess I introduced myself already. I translate Japanese, and I came into literary translation, I was interested in literary translation from early on, but again, realizing that realizing that I needed to, it wasn't necessarily Japanese, it was literary translation in general that I was interested in. I spent many years still studying Japanese and reading as much as I could in an academic setting, but knowing that academia wasn't really the place for me. I thought I'd come at it from trade publishing. So I worked for book publishers and a magazine and literary agents for several years, really just to get in a sense of how that industry worked, and with the idea that I might be able to cobble together something with editing and translating, possibly scouting, or just sort of being involved on different levels with the way that books in translation appear. And so the first books that I actually did were manga. And I think it was some time ago. It was sort of when the manga boom was happening here. So that was pretty lucky in that that's good work for a freelancer because it just keeps going. And anyway, so great to hear from everybody. I think where we were going to start, though, was talking about getting in, maybe talk about some of these academic programs that some of us referenced. And I'm not sure, they do, we were talking about this briefly beforehand, the landscape of MFA programs has changed dramatically in the time span that we're talking about tonight. And there are some of us who can speak more on these, who've been through these programs themselves, and I'm going to let them start speaking. So maybe Allison, if you want to start.
Sure. What I didn't mention is that I was in an MA program for literary translation at the University of Rochester. That is a program that is much less focused on the academic and scholarly side of things. It's a year-long program, whereas most of the MFA programs that you'll come across are 2 to 4 years. It is very closely tied with Open Letter, which is, if you don't already know, look them up. They're amazing. One of the big, that's funny. They're a small press that is big in the translation world. But they're up at the University of Rochester, so Chad Post, the publisher, does a couple of those courses. So there's a lot of focus on the business of publishing and the business of being a literary translator, which was, for me, exactly what I wanted out of more training. I had taken a few years off in between undergrad and going back to get my master's degree. I had found out, and this is very true, that you do not need a master's degree, whether MA, MFA, whatever, to be a literary translator. Absolutely not required whatsoever. And it's not even one of those things that will give you so much more recognition if you get one. So I thought long and hard about going back to school to get another degree, and what I realized was I personally felt like I did not have the writing training, I did not have the connections in publishing, whether translation publishing or just kind of straight publishing, if you want to call it that. I didn't have the resources, the relationships that I wanted. And so that's why I chose the University of Rochester program, and I'm very interested to hear about your MFA experience because I expect it's very different. But as you said, the scene for MA and MFA programs in literary translation is growing in the States, which is awesome. They all have something very different to offer, so if that's something you're interested in, consider what you as an individual needs, and then go look and find a program that'll give you that.
Yeah, the MFA program is very different because you sort of approach translation from a more artistic point of view. So it's not really about the business side. I mean, we do have some life after the MFA panels that come in and talk to us about what real life is like. But mainly in the MFA program, working with translation is like working with your own literature. So we have workshops, we have seminars too, but mainly we have these workshops that are pretty popular where you go home and translate something that you're excited about, and then you bring in copies for the whole class, and then everyone takes them home with them and then make edits, and then we get workshopped in class, and people talk about the different edits they have for the piece, and that was especially interesting for me in poetry because you could really just like go through every single line and like discuss the word choices. With fiction, you know, it's a little more difficult to workshop a whole short story and like talk about it on a sentence level, but for poetry it's particularly interesting to do literary translation in an MFA program because you really get so many great edits, and you really realize, oh, my first draft was really not that good. So you really get a sense of the editorial process more than anything. I would say you learn how to self-edit, but you also learn how to edit other people's texts, and that got me into editing translation myself too.
So yeah, we have a lot to cover tonight. So I'm going to try and keep things moving along. One of the other topics that we wanted to get to tonight was talking about mentors. We wanted to talk about whether or not any of us have worked closely with mentors, or if we feel like we need them or we wish we had them. Actually,
I would love to mentor somebody, but I never had one.
I'd be happy to jump in.
Jump
to
in,
start.
please.
I had some really wonderful mentors when I was starting out. I mentioned Richard Sieberth, Elliot Weinberger as well. They were both very generous with me when I was kind of getting my feet under me.
Can you talk a little bit like what you mean by that? Like what?
Just going through abysmal drafts with a smile on their face. I think we need to bring it up a little bit, no? But never giving up, and over time, kind of checking in and seeing how things were going, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But I think in addition to mentors, I don't think that we can really overlook the value of community, of peers, right? And also the value of editors. And I think that we should maybe talk about this. One of the things that was most meaningful for me, and continues to be, is finding those publications or those publishing houses that really edit work well, because it's very difficult to edit a translation.
That's a good point. Excellent.
And when you find one of those places, you can grow so much as a translator. So I think there's the mentor role, which is somewhat hierarchical, but there's also sort of the exchange that you can have with your peers, with trading drafts, having feedback, and the work that you do with a good editor.
That's a great point. I know that one of us here has a new program, relatively new program that
It's not my program.
Well, somebody is involved with the program that I think we'd like to hear about.
Sure. So the program that she's mentioning is that Alta, the American Literary Translators Association, last year started up a mentorship program, an official mentorship program for emerging translators. One of our funders is sitting in the front row for Catalan. Oh, yeah, of course you are. And they're both in the front row. How could I possibly miss that? Yeah, it's for Polish. So this year we have Catalan, French, and Polish mentorships running. But what I think is really awesome about being able to offer organized mentorships like this is that for those of us who, if you don't want to go into a college program, if you don't have the money to go into a college program, something like that, this is one of those other avenues that you can pursue to get the training, the connections, the relationships, the information, all of that kind of stuff, without having to pay a crap ton of money. So the Alta program was started basically as a carbon copy of an existing program over in the UK, which is the British Centre for Literary Translation program, which is now housed out of Writers' Centre, Norwich. There we go, all of that. But it's one of those really nice things for a very, very, very select few people who manage to get those mentorships. And I think one of the community, as you were saying, is so good. There's so many established translators who are more than happy to receive emails from people who want to start out and give them a little nudge in the right direction. I think you'd said you just got an email from somebody today saying or yesterday maybe, saying, how do I get into literary translation? So those types of relationships too, even if they're not in an academic environment, they can also exist, and you can also ask people for information. So,
do you think it's easier to access these people now?
I mean, in the age of the internet, probably. I also think that as translators and as people who would probably be good at translating, most of us are very shy, reserved people at first, and so it's hard to approach those big famous translators to ask them for help. But as a whole, this entire community is so approachable And I see that at events like this. I see that at the Alta Conference all the time. Basically anyone who you consider to be a big name in translation, you can just walk right up to and say, "Hi, so I'm interested in XYZ, could you help me?" And you just have to have some sort of specific request as opposed to like, "I think you're really cool, tell me what you do," kind of thing.
Be
Yeah,
prepared.
Yeah, exactly.
I also think, the MFA program, at least for me, gave me access to all these major translators.
So that is one of the advantages.
Yeah, I
definitely.
mean,
It's part of what you pay them.
yeah, exactly. Like
Right.
it's the networking aspect that
Right.
that is the greatest part of an MFA program, I think. But yeah, so for me, it's definitely been that, but also like by working as an editor in translation, you get to connect with so many people. I mean, I can highly recommend that for people who are at the beginning of their career, maybe work for an indie publication in translation. Most of them work for free, unfortunately. But that has connected me with so many great translators and authors from all over the world. So I can highly recommend that when you're starting out.
And also just to call attention again to the Alta Conference, because I went to my first one this year and it's extraordinary. The openness and the talent and the kind of candid conversations that happen about translation, I couldn't recommend it highly enough.
And that's open to anybody can
Oh.
attend, is that right?
I believe so.
And it has really good rates for students too. Get very discounted.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there's even a travel fellowship.
Yes, you can apply for travel fellowships as well. Can we put links when the video goes up? Can we just put a list of links down below too? Because we'll put all of this stuff that we've been talking about, all these resources, linked once this video goes up too.
So many of us have started stuff. This is the way that Sal put it. We've started stuff. We've created institutions or publications or resources or things like that. That I don't know if it's something that you just felt a drive to do, or something that you saw a gaping need for, or what. But I guess the question is that something that what was it that drove you to do that? Do you think it's necessary, working as a freelance translator? Do you think it's absolutely necessary, or there does seem to be a lot of that happening right now? So you can sort of feed off of what's going on, but maybe some of us can speak about.
I'd like to speak about that. I think I never pictured myself as a full-time translator, as a hermit in the library. Nor could I have made a living at it. So, and I also see one of the reasons I translate is that I'm in love with this culture, with Catalan culture, and I want to get it to as many people as possible. And translation is one of the ways of doing that. But I also, I worked with the Instituto Manuel for a number of years, and now I've started a foundation. And the thing is that it's Catalan language, Catalan literature is part of a whole package. And so I do everything I can to make sure the package also gets out. Where we left off was that my first book got translated, and it took 20 years for another book to get translated, because I didn't stop trying to place books, but the industry got more complicated and there was much less receptivity until there was this surge of small publishers and cultural organizations giving support to translation. And the Instituto Manuel, I think 5 books have been published this year, 15 in the past 3 or 4 years, and none of that would have happened without this support, which is a virtuous circle, because the publishers can continue to publish translated literature thanks to the organizations.
But so the organization that you started, the Farragut Fund.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something, did you do that for, not for your own purposes exclusively, but I mean, did you do it to, what was the sort of guiding?
Well, the thing is that the Institut Ramon, for example, is its territory is the whole world, and I was interested in Catalan culture in the United States and the specific ties that the Catalan heritage in the United States, which is something that people don't even know exists, and yet there's Guastavino and there who did all of the Beaux-Arts architecture and all over the United States, and not all of it, but a great deal of it. And the missions in California, and this. So the Farragut Fund concentrates on American Catalan heritage, and it will be bringing creative people in the arts back and forth, which is something to work on projects. So we're working on something. I'm developing an area that isn't supported by institutions. So, and I would also, there will be a translation element to it as well.
Okay, that's wonderful. And Heather, I know that you have, you're one of the founding editors of Buenos Aires Review.
I am.
So can you talk about what was, how that came to be?
How did that come to be?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, so I was living in Buenos Aires at the time, and I connected with another translator who was living there, Jennifer Croft. And she and I kind of got to talking about how we wanted to see something, how we knew all of these writers down there who were having trouble kind of accessing the literary marketplace up here. And we wanted to create a space that was a little bit more nimble than print publishing for some of this cultural exchange to happen, not just from Spanish into English, but also from English into Spanish, to kind of provide sort of a not display, but like, some kind of space where, a platform, sure. That works. But sort of a space where people in the literary fields could see what was happening in different languages at a very kind of the moment way. I mean, for me, translation in the broadest sense is literary and cultural advocacy. That's sort of my first and foremost definition of the practice, and that's what we were trying to do. So we brought on 2 more writers, and the 4 of us founded the journal together in 2012, and it's been going ever since.
Do you feel like, actually for both of these things, do you feel like they give you a different kind of access to the business of the world, the business, sort of the mechanics of the way that things work?
I mean, sorry, do you want to?
Okay, I'm thinking.
Well, I'll speak without thinking. So, no, I mean, I think one thing that's been very interesting about the Buenos Aires Review is that it's given me sort of a different perspective on publishing, and in fact has allowed me to kind of take on the role. Not that I'm really worthy to consider myself a mentor, but actually working with emerging translators on their first projects. We're one of those publications that can't pay a lot, but we do work really closely with translators on multiple drafts of their work. And I've noticed that many of these people are using the Buenos Aires Review as like kind of in their curriculum, and it's helping them get in the door in other places. So that's been really rewarding and really interesting, and I think I also have learned a tremendous amount from editing. As you were saying, the process of editing someone else's work is also incredibly illuminating. So in that sense.
And I think the Farriers Fund will help people focus on the fact that there is Catalan culture, and that there is, in a sense, we're handmaidens to the mother country, but the more people know that there is such a thing as Catalonia and Catalan culture, the more they'll be more interested they'll be in reading. I still am baffled. We'll go on to talk, I think, about. I'm baffled to some extent about how to get people to read the books we translate.
Right.
And I think, anything that raises the visibility of foreign cultures adds value, and it makes it easier for the books to get to their readers. Even the political situation in Catalonia, which can be seen as a crisis, but it's also it's brought Catalonia onto the front page of the newspapers, where it had never been. It had always been in the culture or gastronomy or this or that. So, in a sense, all of this is creating a community of influence, I think.
Right. And just one more thing we wanted to sort of talk about was the emerging literary translators. We were talking about.
There's an acronym.
Yes.
There's an organization called ELTNA that I helped to start out, the Emerging Literary Translators Network in America, which is basically just a support group for people who are starting out, because we are so shy and reserved, and we're all sitting in our little desks with our little laptops and have virtually no connection with each other except for events like these. And if you don't live in New York City or something like that, you might not meet other people except at the Alta Conference or something like that. But, I feel like all of these organizations, the literary journals, cultural organizations, all of these things are all started because, yes, we're all creative people, and, we think of things, and so we do them, essentially. But it's also... I think that's just the state that the industry, if you can call it that, or the field of literary translation is in right now. It's in the same sort of, it has been firmly established as a thing. It has started, but it is in the progress state now. So, all of the progress that, let's say, fiction writers and poets were doing 50 and 100 years ago when, the New Yorker was started, and the Paris Review was started, and Massachusetts Review, all of these kinds of things. Now translators are going, hey, well, those are all great, and publishing work in those is all great, and getting our name out there that way is all great too. But we need our own things to showcase our own brand of our own breed and species of writing, and so it is filling that void that existed for so long because translation was just seen as a scholarly thing, and now it's starting to become more of an artistic pursuit.
What do you think, Alice?
What do I think about the starting stuff, you mean?
Or whatever.
Well, I mean, it reminded me of, it's several years ago, I think it was in 2009, I guest edited an issue, Japan issue, the first Japan issue for Words Without Borders, the online literary journal. And that was, at that point, I really was working on my own. I was still working at a literary agency at the time, but I didn't know very many other translators. And it was an opportunity to reach out to people and to say, I'm trying to put this together, do you want to contribute? It gives you an excuse to, to talk to the people who you admire, whose work you admire, and, to just kind of get things started. And it definitely raises your own profile. So I feel like, I do think that as literary translators, since we can't, or if it's something that we do, but it's not the only thing that we do. And so I think that you do kind of become, I'm stealing this from somebody, a spokesperson for, the culture or the language that you're representing. And, I've been working in publishing for a long time, and just because there's so few other people who are actually trying to make the connections between the Japanese writers and the people who represent, the agencies in Japan and the publishers and the editors here. There's so few people it's like lightning in a bottle to get all of those things to line up at the right time. And I've been trying to work that way. And
I think this kind of enterprising spirit also it's very healthy in terms of getting us out of the room. I mean, the translators are now desiring and demanding to be recognized as professionals. And I think that this will also begin to be a virtuous circle. And of course, I think the Penn Translation Committee has certainly contributed to that. Alex and Margaret and Susan before them have been extremely proactive in terms of giving respect to the translator, which is something that didn't automatically happen in publishing.
Definitely
And
not.
so every time we make the translator the protagonist of her or his profession, then I think we're contributing to the value of translation itself as well.
That's a great point. Great point. I'm not sure how we have time for a little bit more. I guess I'm just going to sort of move on to the idea of how to keep doing what we're doing, and that sort of flows from what we're talking about. But the idea of making a living as a translator, or do you see longevity in what we're doing?
Well, I know a bunch of Danish translators who do this for a living, and I'm pretty confident that I could do this too for a living, literary translation, because of the funding opportunities from Denmark. But for me, I wouldn't want to do that, because that would mean taking on books that I'm not necessarily as excited about. So for me, again, this is more of a supplement to my own writing than it is what I want to do full time. So for me, I think it's just more interesting to take on projects that I'm super, super excited about, be it small pieces for journal publication or a book that I'm working on now. So in that respect, it is possible if you're from a wealthy country.
Well represented.
But I mean, even broadly, that's a really good point about if you do choose to make translation your primary source of income, you will very likely be translating things that you wouldn't necessarily choose to translate, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it's just something that one would have to be aware of. Another kind of traditional pairing would also be academia, right? Being a professor and a translator. And I think, speaking sort of from that position, things have gotten a lot better within academia with regard to translation, but I wouldn't say necessarily that it is a comfortable pairing. I mean, the kind of insistence on scholarly publications does make it difficult to carve out time for creative work. So that's something that I would encourage people to be aware of going in. It's not this sort of idyllic space of intellectual exploration that some might think.
But even there, the Modern Languages Association has become more sensitive, and they're trying to put translation on the table as part of our academic credentials, which there had not been. You could put all your translations and they didn't count for anything.
Yes, that's true.
That's being reevaluated, but it's slow.
It's a process, as you were saying. We're still in process.
Yes.
I think that unless you are working from a language that has a very wealthy country behind it, right now, in your first few years, 10 years as a literary translator, you're not going to just be a literary translator and make a living that way. And that's not necessarily that pessimistic of a thing to say, because I think it is also very similar to other creative pursuits, that if you want to just be a fiction writer, for example, you're not going to just make a living off of your fiction writing at the very beginning.
You're not just going to be sitting there writing books the whole time.
Exactly.
There are facets.
I think that goes into what we were talking about. We start all these organizations and we do all these different things. We work as editors, we work as in the cultural organization sphere, all of that, partially because it's interesting for us and we see it as part of our jobs, but also because that's also other ways that you can make money. And it's other ways that you can make money that's not necessarily, if you don't want to be in academia for whatever reason, or if you don't want to do commercial translation, those books that you think are just like, well, I'll get through this and it'll be done and it'll be fine, and then you forget about it. But there are other ways of making a living that are literarily tied, not necessarily translation, but a publishing job or an editing job, something like that. You can do other types of freelance work. There's plenty of different ways to make a living and consider yourself a literary translator. I just don't think it's the only thing. Full disclosure, me personally, I do consider myself a full-time literary translator, but I also have a husband who's an engineer, and so I don't have to worry about making money. So you can
Which is
also
a
just
traditional model.
right. You can also just marry rich. That's an option.
Great option.
That's the old patronage model, though.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. It's called a patronage, not a sugar daddy. But there are options out there for doing, you know, the thing that you love and are passionate about, and still earning money from other avenues.
Does anybody have any other burning
I think
issues to
that
bring
there
up?
was one of the topics was the mistakes
Mistakes, yes.
and things we haven't figured out yet. And I think it speaks to what we've just been talking about, because what I still don't know is how to decide what fee to accept or not to accept. If I'm really, really in love with a book, I had to say no to one book that I had been wanting to translate for many, many years, but the fee was so terrible that it just was alienating. But I think those are the things one has to grapple with. You know, what are you going to do when you find yourself in that situation? Fortunately, I found another book I absolutely adored, and it was.
And what happened with that book? Did somebody else translate it?
Oh yes, but that person had was working at the university, and I wasn't at the time. So, at least it got translated. That's a fine thing. But the book that I recently translated, Private Life, was the perfect storm. It was a proper fee, and it was a beautiful, wonderful publisher, Jill Schoolman at Archipelago, and that sort of compensates for those other situations where you find yourself saying, I'm not going to be able to do this.
By the way, everyone should buy that book. It's fabulous.
I think it's here.
So
They
good.
said it would be here.
Supposedly, it's downstairs. I mean, you had mentioned, Marianne, something about being committed to getting the books that you translate, getting them out into the world and getting them read. And I don't know if that really falls. It's what we still don't know, actually,
Right.
I guess, is what we're trying to figure.
Well, and that, I mean, you can be lucky and have some fabulous writer review your book, or you can, as you know, there all of us, just the books that we've translated, if they come out more or less at the same time, they're bumping up against each other. Then there are only so many books that can be reviewed in the Times or Chicago or LA Times, and so that desire for people to read the book that you love so much. How committed can you be? How can you get behind it? And exactly, I still haven't figured that out.
Well, how do you guys feel about promoting? I mean, that's part of, later on in this series we're going to, we talk about editing and contracts, and we're talking about book selling. But as translators, how do you feel? Do you feel a responsibility to, stand in for the author if they're not in country, or to
Or dead.
Yeah. I think there's a huge expectation, or like kind of I wouldn't say a pressure necessarily on the translator, but it's definitely up to the translator to if they want the book to be noticed anywhere in the literary translation community. I think whenever a translator is being vocal about a book that they're doing and participating in events like this one, I notice it and I know that from the publishing side. I mean, in terms of running reviews of the book, in terms of running excerpts of the book, this is what I had to pick up on all the time. Like, what are people talking about? What's the next big thing? We need to have this lined up, like a review lined up of this book before it comes out. Like, that's the kind of stuff that I've been working with for the past 2 years. So now that I'm translating my first book myself, I am on the other end of it, and I'm so aware of all the things I need to do as a translator to get people's attention. And I'm just overwhelmed by all the opportunities all the time. Like, people offer to interview me about it, or people offer to run excerpts, and I'm like not finished with my with my first draft yet, and I'm panicking, you know, like what to choose first, you know, and then like you missed one deadline and people are like, oh, sorry, we went with another interview because like you didn't get back to us or whatever, you know, like it's really it's hard for a translator to make the time for everything, you know, because you only have the publication year basically, and then after that people sort of move on to the next thing.
Well, I discovered that publishing a book on November 24th, it may not be the best time. Because, you know, you can't.
It's very competitive.
People don't
The fall
have
is very
time to
competitive.
read for example, book lists. Then people don't have time to read it for 2015, and it won't go into 2016. So, for example, and which is one easy way sort of to get attention.
I mean, just to kind of offer the flip side of what you were saying, because it is absolutely true that it's a lot of work, and it's work that's often unpaid, technically. But I love promoting books that I've worked on. I mean, you've lived with a book for a year, 2, sometimes 3 or 4 years, depending on what the cycle was like. And I mean, it's become kind of a part of your body in many ways, and like all of a sudden you get to go and you get to talk about it, and I mean, you know this thing better than, sometimes even better than the author, you know, because you've had to really comb through it. I mean, I remember conversations that I had with Sergio Chafek where I'd ask him about a line and he'd be like, is that in the book? Did I read that? And just, you know, being able to actually share some of that time and experience with this work is also really exhilarating. And it's an avenue that's not just limited to the text. Now we get to improvise a bit, and now we get to kind of, you know, enjoy it, exactly.
I think we'd like to open up for questions from the audience. Have some? Sean?
I wanted to ask a question about the difference between starting out in different languages. I translate Polish, and I felt very lucky to start out with Polish because it's quite a small, tight-knit community, and also there's relatively good funding. But since we have people here from larger languages and also from more smaller or medium-sized languages, and Marianne, you work with Spanish and with Catalan, so maybe you can reflect on so the differences between those two. Do you think it helps starting out with French or with Danish?
Well, I mean, I've only started out with Danish, so, but for me it's been pretty easy to find authors that are great that were not translated. I mean, authors that I grew up with who are huge in Denmark and that no one just knows about over here. I mean, there are so many. So I see a huge potential in the market, and you know, I want to promote my fellow translators from the Danish because I don't see them as competition, and they don't see me as competition because there's so much material, like good material out there, literary material, I should say.
I think that's a translator thing too. I see all of the translators from Catalan as fellow translators.
Yeah.
I
But
think
it's definitely not cutthroat
And
in Danish translation, yeah.
I think the biggest difference might be the funding, because as a French translator from a big language, I still had that same sense of community with all of the French translators, and you know, with a more well-known language, you might have the feeling that, you know, oh, all the good books are already taken, all that kind of stuff. But in reality, you know, more people speak French, so there's way more stuff out there. And I kind of accidentally discovered an entire country that hadn't been like, that shouldn't happen.
How did that happen?
I literally, it was a blog that a woman was running called A Year of Reading the World, and Ann Morgan, and she took a year and read a novel from every country in the world, and most of them were in translation. I was like, oh, that's fun. I'll see what she picked from all the French-speaking countries because I'm interested in that. And Madagascar was, well, I didn't find a novel from this country, so here's what I did instead, and it was really difficult. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And now 2 years later,
Started the field.
Yeah, essentially.
And you'll be sending her a copy, right?
Oh yeah, no, we've been talking for the last 2 years. But that's the thing, is there are so many opportunities no matter what language you're in, that you know there's mentors and everything. So really the difference is the funding, I think.
Lynn?
What kind of thing can you? I'd like to start by saying I'm coming into translation from young adult, which has like gotten super cutthroat, And my question is, because I'm in another field where it seems to be a lot better, a lot more community going on. And what kinds of things can one expect, as a translator starting out, expect from a mentorship in translation? I mean,
In terms of an official, like, organization-run mentorship, or in terms of just approaching someone yourself and saying, hey, I need help with XYZ?
either one, yes.
Okay, well, an official mentorship, I will give you the example of the Alta membership because that's what I know. The way we've set that up is that we have, it is a mentor-mentee driven program. So each language pairing looks a little bit different. The mentor and mentee get together and say, hey, so the mentee brings this project and says, hey, I want to do this. And the mentor's like, okay, I will look at X number of pages. We can talk about it, once a month or whatever. Also, what kind of help do you want in terms of making connections? And they will talk about things like, where the best literary magazines would be to send excerpts and what kinds of people to know in the cultural organizations and all that kind of stuff. In terms of informal mentorships, I feel like any of those questions could be posed to anyone, really. It's, if it's not an official setup, you may want to not drop all of those questions on them at once until you see if you can actually form a good relationship with them. But I feel like the idea of mentorships just in general is, what do you as a beginner or as someone who's just starting out need to learn?
But it may be hard in a specific area like young adult literature. It may not. I don't know. I think it's easier. At Alta, probably there are more people doing adult literature. Unless.
Probably?
Yeah, I would be looking at moving into adult literature,
Mm-hmm.
kind of leaving young adult.
Oh, it's a very welcoming community.
It is.
As far as career trajectory is concerned, I was wondering if anyone could speak about, I know it isn't always like a decision, but the difference between publishing with a smaller press early on or trying to hold out for a more well-known press. Like if you had a project that maybe a smaller press was interested in and then maybe a bigger press was curious about or something like that. Because I know with some people say with fiction, well, people have different opinions, so I don't want to take the response necessarily. But.
Well, I will say it's a great idea to start out with a well-known small press, like Open Letter, for instance. Valeria Luiselli had a smash hit with a coffee house press, which is also a small press. And I heard her speak at Columbia and say she was really happy that she started out with a smaller press because they sort of, it's a labor of love for them, so they really sort of spread the word about her book in a way that a big press wouldn't necessarily do for a book in translation. So I know that from people I know also who have published with a bigger press and who have been disappointed by the lack of marketing, to say the least.
Yes, because the big press, the advantage would be they're spending more money on it, but on a translation they're less likely to do that. So
Because it's a numbers game, because a small press, especially one focused on translation, they have 10 books or 12 books total per year that they are putting their entire marketing budget into, and that might be a small marketing budget, it might be a small amount of people that are doing their marketing and promoting, but with a big house you've got hundreds of books, and so they're putting most of their weight behind kind of their top 5 or something like that they think are going to get the most buzz, and that could be bestsellers that none of us are ever going to do anything with, because chances are it's not going to be a translation, because you basically get one translation bestseller at a time. And you had the My Struggle books, and now it's kind of moved on to Ferrante, but they don't really exist simultaneously. You can't be excited about both of them at the same time in this country. But so I would actually agree with everybody else that it's not necessarily starting with a small press as a fallback kind of thing. It might actually be better for you in terms of training. You'll probably get more editing experience with them. In terms of the marketing aspect, they're going to spend more time on your book. So
Also in terms of getting reviewed, sorry.
yes.
In terms of getting reviewed. And also, I mean, the thing that I was saying before about editing, larger houses don't necessarily have editors that are extremely experienced with editing translations, whereas the smaller houses like Open Letter, Deep Vellum, Archipelago, I mean, these are presses that know how to edit a translation and can really help develop the project, but also help you develop as a translator. So that's a tremendous benefit to working with a house like that.
I think it seems obvious that the panel is skewing a particular way, but I think that having worked for one of the larger houses, and I think there are, there's the prestige of, recognizable publishers, but I think that a lot of the smaller publishers have, I don't disagree with anything that any of you said. I would definitely, there are many advantages to working with the smaller independent publishers who really know how to, they are well connected with the literary translation world, but the larger houses distribution is, you can't count that out. And I think that, whereas these smaller publishers do have, they're usually involved with larger distributors. If we're talking about, specifically about the way that the publishing industry works, Random House is going to be able to get your book, one copy of your book in, all of the book. Most bookstores will buy a copy of it, and then it might get returned later. But it's but the prospect of having it, cover the country as opposed to the smaller houses are a lot more targeted. So it really depends on the project that you're working on and who you want. If you sort of know specifically the editor at a larger house. Some of them are extremely talented and have lots of experience working with translation. So,
but I didn't want to imply that there weren't any.
No, I certainly, and I don't think that it necessarily has that much to do with where you are in your career. Obviously, when you're looking for more feedback, I think you're probably going to get it from a smaller house. Whereas, I think the larger houses work better with the platform. Once you already have a platform, once you have a list, once you have your own list, that author has their own list. I think, my experience right now, I think, is that a lot of the larger publishers, well, everybody in general, but specifically the larger publishers, are looking to commit to an author, not just one book. They're looking for an author who's going to keep publishing books, who has a backlist perhaps, and they want to, they want to represent them, they want to publish their work in this language in this country. So, and it's not to say that the smaller publishers, but you don't know what they're able to commit to.
And some of the it also goes back to reviewing again, because some of the smaller Archipelago has great distribution. Every bookstore I've been to has at least one copy of Private Life on a shelf. But, in only a couple of stores is it on a table.
Mm-hmm.
And until it gets reviewed
Right.
in a major publication, it will stay on the shelf. So, it's interesting. It's
a good question.
I think we have time for I'm so sorry, but just one last question. Every time, with wine and book sales afterwards, when anybody wants to chat.
Burning.
So if someone has a burning question, now's the time.
Margaret.
Yeah.
I did find a book that I wanted to translate by an Argentine author, but I found the publishing rights in all that world very difficult to navigate. That was very overwhelming to me, so I thought maybe you could speak to that.
Well, that's a very large
That's
question,
a-
and we
maybe
actually,
that's a wine question.
It is, but that's also the subject of the series. The next two are about publishing. One is about editing, and one is about contracts, and that definitely, it's a large world to navigate, but.
I think we do one more question.
Can we do Margaret? Can we get Margaret's question?
Okay, so at the outset, Sal said, in the past 10 years, translations have grown absolutely. issues for translators have been pretty much the same for maybe 50 years. I've just done a little bit of archival research. One of the most persistent problems is name the translator in reviews. So I would like to hear, particularly from the emerging translators, whatever that means. What kind of advocacy is needed, really? I mean, I have done some advocacy. Marianne and myself have done some things. I did something today to get someone's name on a review. How burning an issue is this for you?
Well, I am happy that you've done this work because I was aware of your work before I was offered my first book contract. So I made sure it was on my contract that my my name was on the cover of the book, for instance, and I will certainly hunt people down if they do not mention my name in in these reviews. If I get any reviews, who knows? But I think that the younger generation of translators are aware of this too because of the work that's being done right now.
So it's a second wave.
Yeah, it's a second wave, and I think we feel.
Following in our footsteps, I mean, basically, because it really can get very confrontational.
Yeah.
With reviewers, they
Yeah.
just don't like to be told that
Yeah.
they need to do something different.
I mean, I don't really know what to say about that except I've seen confrontations from between younger translators and actually mainly publishers right now and not reviewers. And that has gotten pretty ugly. But I think that's something that we just need to address in order to change anything. So for me, at least, I have the activist perspective, but I don't know if anyone else is a little less confrontational. Could be.
By nature, I am less confrontational, but that is one issue that I absolutely will not back down on, whether it's for me or somebody else. There's been a lot of, for example, there's a Twitter campaign, #NameTheTranslator, that was, I believe, started in part by Elton's sister organization over in the UK, the Emerging Translators Network, and it is all of these, roughly speaking, emerging translators, roughly speaking, younger people, taking to social media and just blasting people sometimes when it's very clear that the translator should be named in something. And a lot of times I've seen it work. I don't know if it's the kind of thing where global change is going to come about just because we yell at people kind of thing. I think there's much more kind of on the education front, and that's a whole nother question for another day, but that's, I think, part of the state of the industry is that at the very least we as translators and as translator advocates are starting to talk about how can we do this instead of just lying down and taking it and saying, oh, well, I got to translate a book and I'm just in the background. So, it's the progress is starting to be made thanks to people like you too.
Yeah. But also in terms of, while working as an editor of translation reviews, for instance, like I've had to ask people to write a paragraph about the translator, for instance, because that was just not present. So that's something that I have concretely worked with. And also when I edited a Danish feature for Asymptote, I was interviewed about the feature, and the journalist had just written the names of the authors who were featured in the translation journal, and I politely emailed the journalist and said, would you please also name, here are the names of the translators, you can just copy paste, and she did that. So
yeah, I think it's also a qualitative issue, right? I mean, the first step, of course, is getting the translator named. The second step is also educating reviewers about how you can talk about a translation if you're not necessarily able to read the work in the original. That's also a very complicated question, and I don't think we can resolve that at this table right now. But there is kind of a second step, maybe once the awareness is continued to build, we can work toward that.
Thank you all for sort of leading things into the future events. It seems like we have more things to talk about. Thank you for coming. Thank you to the wonderful participants, and thanks to the Center for Fiction for hosting us. Please support both them and the Translators by buying the books that they've translated and the Center for Fiction sells right at that table, right in the back there, and also down in the bookstore. And please come back next month, March 15th. We'll be right here and we'll be talking about editing.